Ask that you'd forgive me. I am giving the Palm Sunday sermon and Easter sermon together, and I'm doing it the day after Easter, which is basically in a t-shirt. I came to the church today to clean up, tie up some loose ends after Easter worship, all the activities yesterday, which were incredible in all of the respects. Both the sunrise service, enjoying First Baptist Church of Hillsboro, and Easter worship, and then coming back and a wonderful time with here in Nokomis. But that said, there are two sermons to present because they build on top of each other. We need to go back to Palm Sunday in order to appreciate the sermon of Easter, of the resurrection. Well, John chapter 11 is the story of Lazarus dying and Jesus raising him from the dead. And most of us have heard that story. But today, I want to emphasize how important that is to a building up to the resurrection, Jesus' own death and resurrection, and how that has cosmic implications, eschatological implications. That's not just in the moment saying because he can raise Lazarus from the dead, that of course he himself can be raised from the dead. There is a reason that God allows Jesus to do this with Lazarus, but when we ask that same request, God heal, please bring back our loved ones. I'm going to explain why that's not always the case for us. Let's at least begin in John chapter 11 with verse 3. So Mary and Martha, the two sisters of Lazarus, they sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." Now Jesus is John says, near the Jordan River. He's likely a day, maybe 2 days away. So by the time the messengers get to Jesus, it's likely that Lazarus is already dead. And we know this because John tells us in verse 17. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Jesus has this conversation with the disciples to set the stage for the importance of his visit to Bethany and to this raising of Lazarus. But there is this reminder that that doesn't happen in our time. And sometimes that patient journey is through suffering, even as we hope for miracles. Now, for us to understand how this happened, we can't just get to Lazarus being raised from the dead. We have to understand Jesus coming into Bethany now. It's been a few days. The messengers have already gone to tell him. They've come back with Jesus. Jesus finally makes his way to Bethany. And this is now the 4th day. In other words, it's a funeral procession. Lazarus has been put in the grave and friends are comforting Martha and Mary. It says in verse 19, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss, much like a funeral. You can't appreciate this story if you haven't been in that moment. To understand loss, I've been with families, loved ones who die unexpectedly. I've been in the hospital with a wife who loses her husband. I've been with people who see the average surgery, the expecting full recovery surgery to turn for the worse. I too have suffered loss. I know how difficult it is to be in a funeral home, to be at a visitation. I have had those experiences in so many ways that I don't think it's beyond any of us to have that we haven't been touched by death and it hasn't impacted us in some way. And as a result, we become fearful of death and we are fearful of losing the ones we love. So anything that has a dying sensation to it, anything that reflects this diminished capacity becomes an overwhelming fear for many of us. This is what Jesus enters into, the valley of the shadow of death. Mary and Martha approached Jesus as he enters Bethany. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. Mary stayed in the house with the people that were comforting her. But Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know God can give you what you ask." Now Mary and Martha are wanting of their brother, and they're wanting of Jesus to do what they've seen him do. He's performed miracles. He's walked on water. The stories are plenty at this point of what he is capable of doing. They want this, even now, with their brother. Jesus tells her, your brother will rise again. Martha says, yes, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Jesus is already emphasizing that even in the midst of your suffering, there is a life after death. And it's important that our hope rests first in that eternal resurrection, not an earthly restoration. Martha and Mary both want this. Even after Jesus comes in, Mary is approached by Martha and says, Jesus is here. Mary leaves her friends to go, but her friends think that she's left to go back to the tomb, and they go to comfort her as well. So now there's this crowd of people coming out to Jesus. Jesus didn't go into the home, likely because everywhere he went, there was attention to him and a crowd, and it would cause disruption in the midst of the mourning. But to have Mary come to him, to allow him to comfort her in her time of loss, and everyone follows with her. Mary approaches him, immediately going to him, and Jesus stayed outside of the village, and the people follow. And Mary saw that he was there, so she went up to him, and at his feet she said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. You hear how both Mary and Martha want something to change? You ever had that prayer? I've even known parents who lost their children, and in the moment of death, in the moment of tragedy, I have said that prayer. I have said, Lord, please bring this child back to life. You can do this. You can take the soul that is with you in heaven and you can restore it to this body and return this child to their parents. But it doesn't happen. I've seen miracles. I've seen people who had restored health. I've seen people who were next to death come back to be with loved ones and make a full recovery. And I've heard stories of people who have actually died and have come back to life. Those are the stories we hear that we put our hope in. And so we read the story of Lazarus, much like Mary and Martha, and when we are wanting in the face of difficult circumstances, we ask why. God, why would you allow this to happen if you're capable of stopping it? I want to remind everyone that in this moment, Jesus is not without sharing with us in that suffering. The assumption in the story is that he's sort of distancing himself from the concerns of the people, that it's beneath him. But if you read into John how much his emotions get the best of him, you understand how much he cares. When Jesus saw that Mary was weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him. He was deeply troubled. He says, where have you put him? They told him, Lord, come and see. The shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35, and Jesus wept. He hurts with the people at the causality of death. That for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin is death. And in this way, he hurts too. He arrived at the tomb in a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. And Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside, and Jesus looked up to heaven and he prayed. Now, just before this, Martha said, he's been dead 4 days. He's going to smell. And Jesus ignores that, has them roll the stone away, and then he prays, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I say this out loud for the sake of all the people standing here, so that they'll believe you've sent me. And then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come forth. The dead man came out, his head and his feet bound with grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told him, unwrap him and let him go. We see this moment of the story and we think that's why God is capable of doing for me what he did for Mary and Martha. What we miss is that the story is actually about the position in which Jesus is in at the time that he calls Lazarus back to life. In other words, the juxtaposition of Jesus is standing right outside the tomb. When the divine calls us to come forth, we are going to go to him. In this instance, where is Jesus? The incarnation of Christ is that he is standing in the flesh, still among the people, facing the tombstone. When he calls Lazarus, Lazarus will come back from the grave and come to Jesus. That moment is one that we often overlook because we think that God is going to continue to call us forth into his glory, and hopefully that would be back with our friends. But the truth is, after the resurrection, which we'll talk about here shortly in the next sermon, there is this place of which Jesus is going to be, and then when he calls us, that is the position that he calls us for. Death is often like life and death in this mix, like a river. The Niagara River flows from Lake Erie into Lake Ontario. And as it comes through, of course, if you've been to Buffalo, you've seen the Niagara Falls. It actually drops more than 300 feet from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. About 170 feet at its peak at Niagara Falls. Once you're born, you are entered into this river of life. And you may want to get around death. You may not want to go over those falls. But at some point you will. There's no getting away from it. You could try to pedal backwards. You could try to go to the fountain of youth and keep that and stave off death. But at some point, even if you can slow it down, it becomes us all. You go over the falls. You go to another side from which you don't return. In this instance, Jesus is in a boat like the rest of us. He's on this side of life. So when he calls Lazarus, he literally does reach over the falls and draw him back to himself. But the point still remains. Lazarus is just simply going to die again. A physical healing is still going to result in a physical death. What Jesus speaks into the moment with Martha and with Mary and to us is, do you believe that I am the way, the truth, and the life? That if you believe in me, you will never die. In other words, death will not be a finality, it'll be a physical death, but you and your heart, your spirit, your soul will never die. The joy of our relationship with Christ is not that he gets us around the falls. He doesn't get us to the shore and allow us to not face death. It is that he goes through it with us. Palm Sunday was about Jesus going into Jerusalem. He knew what he was going into Jerusalem to do. Ironically, he stays with Lazarus and Martha and Mary, and they celebrate Jesus because of what he's done. And Lazarus is sitting there among them, and they are celebrating life and miracles. But can you imagine, even then, Jesus knows what's coming? In an ironic way of foreshadowing his own death, Mary washes his feet. Judas is upset because you could use that money to pay for the poor, but John says that he was just stealing from it anyway. He was just being greedy. And Jesus knows it is right. He says it's right for what she's doing right now. She was anointing him and preparing him. Preparing him to do what we all eventually do. Even God would not skirt around death. He has been where you are, where you have been. He has been through the valley of the shadow of death. And he calls us from the other side. That's the position in which he's in. Of course, you can't get to Easter unless you go through Good Friday. So if you're thinking about the people that you love who have gone before you, take a moment to be silent. To allow those moments and those emotions that they're okay. Even Jesus was angry about death. Even Jesus hurt and wept. But while that moment is true for you, and it's true for me, may there be a moment where you also say, but Lord, you've called my loved ones to the other side. I would love to have them back. But ultimately, more than anything, I want them to know the paradise that you have planned for us. That I can come be with them someday soon. Maybe not too soon, but someday. Amen.